Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Catherine Leswing, and I work for the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. I'm here today with my colleagues Lisa Hayward and Molly White. And Molly White's going to be taking us through some of the back to school guidance that came out of the START task force just a few weeks ago. And in particular, she's going to be talking about trauma responsive instruction and professional development for it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Molly.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Catherine. And I want to thank my colleagues, Catherine and Lisa, for joining me. I'm going to be throwing some questions their way. And if you have questions about the guidelines, feel free to put them in the chat as well, and we'll answer those as they come through. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so today we're talking about professional development and trauma responsive instruction. It was section 10 on the guidance, subsection B, and the guidance really outlines, areas of focus to think about as you're reopening. And I'm going to give you just a brief overview or synopsis of this section. So the districts it was suggested that you should be prepared to address a wider range of mental health, social, emotional wellness needs of not just your students, but your staff as well when you're reopening. We've all gone through a lot with this pandemic and remote learning and shifting the way we know education to be in our world. So thinking about addressing all of everybody's needs in the best way possible. So with that, they add that professional development around the topic of trauma responsive instruction should be spread across the year. You don't want to front load all of this information and then kind of let it fall to the wayside as other issues crop up throughout the year. You want to make sure that your professional development is really strategically placed. A lot of times you could think about placing them at the beginning of the year after a big break, like holiday break in the winter. And that way you can ensure that it's something that is kept up with and it's not just a beginning of the year initiative. The guidance also encourages you to make sure that the professional development that you provide is able to be applied into everyday practice. So if you're providing professional development that requires a system or framework, you want to make sure that framework's in place. And we'll talk about that a little further into this presentation too. The recommendations encourage you to leverage community partners. And then also in that spirit of your community assets, look into local resources that can address student trauma, social, emotional well-being, and mental health. And then finally, the recommendations encourage you to organize and systematize a referral process. So when teachers and staff identify students and families that could use additional supports, there's an easy system right in place for them to use to access these resources. So I'm going to throw my first question out to my colleagues. I'm curious why you think that the recommendations included professional development for trauma responsive instruction. Some technical difficulties, no worries.
Sorry.
I think that it is really telling that this language is being used across the state now to talk about education and the professional development of teachers. I know that my time in the classroom, I did not get any formal professional development for trauma responsive instruction. And I realize now what a disservice that was to the students that I was teaching, many of whom came to school having experienced adverse childhood experiences or that then translated into trauma for them. And I think that now, and really this guidance document really emphasizes this, that all students have experienced some level of trauma with the pandemic, and just how important it is that teachers know how to respond to that. And the last thing I'll say about it, I think it's a really good question, Molly, is that when we talk about trauma responsiveness, sometimes it's easy for us to think, oh, trauma being trauma responsive means that I'm able to attune with the 1 or 2 kids in my class who've really experienced something traumatic. But the reality is that being a trauma responsive instructor means that you are able to foster empathy and respond to the range of emotions that all humans exhibit. And so it's really a toolkit for attuning to all your students.
I think that's really a perfect answer, Catherine, and I'm sorry about the technical interruption earlier. But I just want to add, we're really fortunate that we live and work in a state that really values wellness as much as the academic experience of our students. And actually so much so that it's written into Chapter 10 and addressed in the minimum standards. So I think it's really necessary to actually demonstrate in a very viable way that professional development about trauma responsive instruction is so relevant when we know for a fact that not just in New Hampshire, but across the world, students of all ages are experiencing some level of trauma as we move through this really unmitigated and unprecedented experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in. I think understanding that, trauma, a lot of things have the potential to be traumatic. And, as both of you kind of touched on, if we can mitigate some of those experiences, it can really help the individual student, but also the culture and climate of the school. So with that, this is kind of a summary of the recommendations, but I'm going to start getting into some concrete thoughts and then actual resources that you guys can take the links of and go and do your own research for your professional development, what makes sense for you and your staff. So quickly, I just want to touch on an overview of trauma responsive instruction. Trauma responsive instruction is instruction that understands trauma's impact on learning, understanding brain development and how the brain is affected when it is experiencing trauma, and even after the trauma has happened, how the brain then develops. Trauma responsive instruction ensures that students feel safe, not just physically safe, but socially, emotionally, and academically safe. They're able to take chances and be kind of vulnerable in that space. The needs of the whole student are addressed in trauma responsive instruction, just like with the feelings of safety. If a student is, feeling tired because they didn't get sleep because of a, community or domestic violence that was happening the night prior, recognizing that tiredness and not forcing academics on that student is one way to be trauma responsive. Just allowing them time to nap because that's what their body needs is really addressing the whole student. Trauma responsive instruction is connected to the community. You access the resources that are available within the context of where your students live. You share responsibility for all students in that same spirit. The person that transports the child to school is equally as responsible as the teacher that delivers the content, and the hall monitor or the principal that greets everybody as they arrive. You want to make sure that everybody is sharing responsibility for these students and that they're really seeing each student. And when you do that and take the time to greet and see each child, that's where you can really catch some of the warning signs of a traumatic experience. And then finally, to be trauma responsive, you really want to make sure that you're adaptable. The needs of your students change rapidly, and just like the needs of our educational environment has changed rapidly with COVID-19, trauma is really, it manifests differently in different people. So this was all adapted from 6 Ways to Become Trauma Informed from Resilience Research. So that link is there on the slide. I encourage you to do more research on this yourself. This is just the briefest overview of trauma responsive instruction before I hop into professional development for trauma responsive instruction.
And for those who are watching along with us on YouTube, I am putting into the chats the direct links for these resources. So you should be able to just click over to them as we go along if there's something that interests you.
Thank you for that. So as we're thinking about this upcoming school year, the recommendations did say, professional development needs to be spread across the year. And some schools are thinking about going back in person, but that might not last the whole year. When we're thinking about increased in cases or other changes that might occur, we want to make sure that our professional development is able to be manipulated to be virtual or hybrid or in person. And in that same spirit, we also want the professional development to be adaptable for individuals. Some people might be there and ready to be in person, but having a virtual opportunity still available for those in a high risk category or other circumstances that prevent them from being in person is going to be really important as we move forward. So again, I want to toss a question out to my colleagues. How do you think professional development is going to need to be changed to fit all these different formats?
Molly, that's, if you don't mind if I'll jump in, that's such a great question because it speaks to our whole tradition of education. So historically, we're so comfortable with in-person education and in-person training. And when the online educational world started emerging, there was so much suspicion about whether or not online or hybrid training could be effective. And, over the past 15 years, I think everything shows that online and hybrid training, if done correctly, can be just as effective, if not more effective, than in-person training that we're used to. So I think for those of us who are accustomed to in-person training and professional development and learning, might take a little bit of a switch to actually move to a hybrid and virtual environment. But once we make the mental shift and we understand it can be incredibly effective, we're going to be fine. And I am so sorry.
There goes the technology again.
I think Lisa's spot on, though. I think that when we figure out ways to be creative, these experiences can have just as much of an impact. And just thinking to my own personal experience with distance learning, online learning models, the ones that have been the most impactful have been ones that have required in some way that I interact with my peers. Whether through a discussion board or there's some sort of exchange, interpersonal exchange, even if it's happening at a distance. I think those are the memories that you hold on to and that you take away.
Absolutely. I think you both kind of touched upon it, but the interactions with people is so important. The breakout sessions in Zoom, while the room configuration can be a little confusing, I think that's been one of the biggest game changers for me in my online learning, whether we're in professional development or giving webinars, having that opportunity to be in smaller groups and to put your heads together and really think about the content being delivered is a great way to adapt from in-person to virtual.
I will say as an aside, and really interestingly, is I love distance learning and online education, and I think it's an amazing way, especially for adults, to learn. But there's been some very recent research showing how traumatic, to get back to your previous slide, Molly, how traumatic it can feel for some adults as well as children to have the camera turned on and have their whole private world, I suppose, exposed in some sense. So it was really interesting to me to see your previous slide on trauma and your transition to online learning. So that was really great.
That's a great point. In thinking about students at home, if they're virtual learning, it could be, even for students, they could be kind of self-conscious of their background and, other noises going on. So being aware that some students just might not be there and ready to be face-to-face, but are still going to be engaged in the learning. So thinking about being flexible with cameras on and off and that kind of instruction is definitely trauma instructive and trauma sensitive. Thanks for bringing that up. So some of the strategies in terms of professional development, they're pretty similar for educators. You can have coaching strategies, webinars, there's tons of learning modules that I'll be sharing with you. They're kind of like virtual college classes that you can take for professional development and earn CEUs. In terms of helping students become trauma aware and trauma sensitive, you can work on small groups. Educating students about brain development can be super impactful, having them understand their stress response system. And that's like fight, flight, or freeze can be super helpful in them understanding how they react to certain triggering events. And then we can support families through helping them know the signs of trauma and know what to look for. Just because an event is adverse, having a car accident would be a really terrible thing to happen, but it's not necessarily going to be traumatic for everybody. So equipping families with the knowledge of what somebody going through in a traumatic event looks like is going to be really helpful in supporting them, and also helping them know what is developmentally appropriate. Actions that teenagers take after a traumatic event are going to look different than a younger child. So helping them know what is developmentally appropriate and what might be a cause for concern or something to look into is also going to be beneficial for families. I also included a link there, helping children cope with traumatic events from Childmind. I'll share the resource later. I just thought it was important to throw that right there, and with supporting families. Linking them to things like this is going to guides and other resources is, one great way to help support them. So some considerations when we're thinking about professional development and launching it at our schools or within our districts, funding is always one of the first things that comes to mind. Where are we going to pull the resources to have this professional development, especially if it's going to be year long, that's not just a one-time fee. So there's two federal opportunities, one with the CARES Act. They have the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund written in. They have grant opportunities. And then Every Student Succeeds Act has professional development opportunities for funding, and Title 4A funds efforts for the whole child. And being trauma informed is definitely a whole child effort, like I talked about before. Doing it correctly ensures that students' needs are being met at all levels, academically, social, emotionally, and physically. Another consideration that you really want to take into mind when you're instituting a trauma-informed way within your school or district is how are you going to communicate your trauma-responsive approach, not just to your staff, but to your students, to your families, and your community. You want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. If you're going to start using a word like trauma in school, you kind of want families knowing why your student's coming home talking about this, or how they can support this type of conversation at home. And then the last consideration I'll throw out there is quality improvement. How are you going to know that your trauma responsive strategy is actually benefiting your students, your staff, your families, and your community? When you're implementing something like a trauma-informed program or a trauma-responsive approach, you want to make sure that your efforts are actually paying off. So having some sort of baseline of culture, climate, or a teacher survey about students' trauma responsiveness would be a great way to then measure further down the line how their mindsets have shifted, how what skills they've developed as well. So again, I would love to open up for a conversation about the importance of communication to my colleagues. Why do you think it's so important that families and communities are aware of the trauma responsive instruction happening in schools?
Well, I think that when we think about how we can attend to students' needs, there's the classic proverb, it takes a village, but I really believe that the more access students have to supports and interventions, the more likely they'll be able to respond to those supports and interventions. And so the more people you have on board helping students navigate life and challenges, and then providing them with those supports and speaking the same language, I think the greater the impact you're going to have. It also goes to it speaks to something that we as an office really value and try to infuse into all of our work, which is family engagement and family-driven programs and communication. And I think that the more involved in a student's academic life and just programming, the better the outcomes for the student. So I think it's that sort of, it takes a village mentality. I don't know, Lisa, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think sometimes when we go through trauma, all of us, children and adults, we don't know that we've gone through trauma. We just know that something doesn't feel right in our lives, in our minds, in our bodies, but we don't always know what it is. And certainly not everyone has got enough self-awareness for all kinds of reasons to really say, I just went through something really traumatic. This is why I'm feeling like this, or this is why I'm responding like this, or this is why my body is doing this, or this is why I can't think. So being aware of what trauma is and being cognizant of, hey, I went through trauma, this is why I'm feeling like this, it helps us be more forgiving with ourselves, and it allows us to have the language to reach out for help and for support. So I think being aware of trauma, it sounds obvious, but I don't think it is.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. Some traumatic events are really obvious and others are less so. So equipping everybody with the understanding of a trauma responsive approach through your professional development and outreach to communities is going to be huge. It'll pay off in dividends as everybody becomes a little more trauma responsive. So this is a direct quote from the actual guidelines itself. Within the section of professional development, it encourages the leveraging of knowledge and relationships from our community partners, taking inventory and stock of community resources, creating a list of these resources, and having supports available for staff and families and students. So I wanted to take this direct quote and kind of align it with what we do here at the Bureau of Student Wellness. So at the Bureau of Student Wellness, we organize ourselves in this kind of infographic. We say that MTSSB organizes people to analyze data, to make a plan, to implement strategies and evaluate outcomes. So when you're thinking about that previous slide and the actual recommendations themselves recommend that you partner with your community partners and your local resources, that's really the organizing people step. Getting everybody together at the table to see what resources are available to serve your students in a trauma-informed way. Then we talk about, measuring quality. That's analyzing data. We're going to take baseline. How are our students currently operating? Are there some students that are constantly checking in with the nurse and all those types of other data points that you could access? You'll make a plan and implement strategies based on that data. And then, like I was talking about previously, you're going to evaluate your outcomes and ensure that quality improvements are being made. So I just wanted to draw this connection to MTSSB, which is what the Office of Student Wellness, currently works toward implementing in schools and exploring in districts. A lot of the recommendations can be tied right into this framework. So I just wanted to draw that connection for everybody. And now I'll finally get to the resources and tools that were promised. Reading through the guidelines, there was a ton of different topics, but looking at local resources is really a great place to start when you're thinking about a trauma supportive environment. So I just wanted to highlight here at the Office of Social Emotional Wellness, we have the YouTube page, NH Student Wellness, which if you're watching right now, you found. And we also have our resource website, nhlearnsremotely.com. Both of these are great resources. And we also, as consultants, go out to districts and schools and offer coaching. So if there is additional supports that you need regarding this topic or other professional development topics, feel free to reach out on our website, and we're happy to respond with slides or presentations and the like. This next slide is a map of New Hampshire, but it's broken down by mental health regions. So the Department of Health and Human Services provides community mental health based on your regions. So I want to encourage everybody to kind of get familiarized with this. For example, if you're living in Concord, your school or district would be reaching out to Riverbend Community Mental Health. This was a big part of the recommendations, is getting acquainted with your community mental health. They can provide a bunch of resources, but also mental health services to your students that are experiencing trauma. So I want to toss this question back out to my colleagues. You know, a lot of times people will say, oh, it's so important to reach out to community mental health partners. But I was hoping you could touch upon why it's so important to leverage and engage community mental health partners while we think about being trauma responsive.
Well, I think in our work and as it relates to integrating mental health in public schools or in schools in general in the state, you know, it really comes down to how do we best serve kids and how do we make sure all students are ready to learn every day. And we know that when we've experienced a traumatic event, it's really difficult to come to school and focus on the math problem when something really hard to deal with has happened recently. And I think for us, a lot of the times it's about access. So if I have parents who are working 2 jobs and I rely on their transportation to get to the community or to get to my mental health appointment, that may limit when and how often I can see a mental health provider. So I think creating those strong bonds between mental health providers, community mental health centers, and schools really can change the game when we think about how we can make sure that all students are coming to the table ready to learn.
I think that's a perfect answer, Catherine, to a really, really great question. I would just add that many of our community mental health partners know so much more. They've got their finger on the pulse. They know about treatments, prevention, best practices, up and coming new research. So we should take advantage of what they want to share with us. Many times we know that they have a mission that embraces school districts. So they're as hungry to hear from us as we are to reach out to them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Teachers are amazing and they know a lot about a lot of things, but having the mental health perspective can sometimes be so important and crucial and, life-saving depending on where a student is in a traumatic experience. So definitely important to leverage these community partnerships and these community mental health centers. Moving on, some other local resources that I wanted to highlight here are the New Hampshire Children's Behavioral Health Collaborative. They offer tons of different webinars and resources, along with the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I have attended, that's the one right in the center here. I have attended plenty of their webinars. They really have kind of figured out virtual learning. They make their presentations interactive and engaging, and they're hard topics to talk about, but really concrete steps that you can walk away with in support of, supporting students and families going through a tough time. The Family Resource Center on the top right is another great resource. They provide direct resources to families in New Hampshire, and they also provide webinars as well. On the bottom right, the University of New Hampshire has plenty of professional development and training opportunities there as well. I do encourage you to check those out, but look at the delivery method. They are planning to have some in person, and personally, I know I would reach out and see how they're planning to adjust those to be virtual. And that's with any professional development. being knowledgeable at the onset and asking how they're going to adapt to be virtual or remote or hybrid should the need arise. And then finally, on the bottom left is the North Country Education Services. They have kind of partnered and become the North Country Partnership for SEL. And social emotional learning is a huge part of being trauma responsive. Having those social emotional skills really equips a student with the skills they need when they face a traumatic event. So they have released some SEL competencies that are from birth to adulthood. And I encourage you guys to go out on this website and go through all of their different offerings. They also offer webinars with the Leslie Institute on SEL, and Lynn Lyons also is another webinar that they offer. Another local resource is Dr. Cassie Ackley. She is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to being trauma responsive and brain development. She provides external links to resources, but also provides keynote speeches and short and long-term coaching sessions, really intensive ongoing sessions, but some brief overviews as well. So I encourage you to check out her website. She's a great local resource based right here in New Hampshire. She provides tons of different background on brain development, which is really foundational in understanding how to be trauma responsive. And we're moving into online resources available for professional development now. The Center on the Developing Child, based out of Harvard and Cambridge, has a whole guide to toxic stress. And I know we're talking about trauma responsive schools, but toxic stress occurs when an individual is experiencing strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity. So things like emotional abuse, sorry about that, caregiver substance abuse, caregiver mental illness, something that's really prolonged and pervasive in their life, serious neglect. So this toxic stress has the potential to really have a negative impact on children. This online resource is a guide that walks you through not just the science of toxic stress, but how to prevent toxic stress and how to address it after it has been experienced. Another online resource, this institute is also based out of Massachusetts. They're called the Rennie Center for Educational Research and Policy. They have a back to school blueprint that helps you think about going back to school after COVID-19, but their action guides I found to be really relevant. Helping students heal from trauma is the first guide. Rebuilding community is a very important aspect about thinking about these kids that had an interrupted year last year and now they're coming back. How are you going to rebuild that community? So another great resource that you can access when you're thinking about professional development for yourself and others. And here are some national resources. So the Family Informed Trauma Treatment Center has a toolkit out that increases awareness of the impacts of trauma, not just on a student, but on the whole family system. So this toolkit has resources to advance clinician attitude, knowledge, and skills in family-informed trauma treatment practices. And it just increases awareness of theoretically sound and evidence-informed trauma interventions. So this is a great resource when you're thinking about trauma and its impacts on family systems. And this link will be added to the PowerPoint and shared. I realize that it is not on the screen right now. Sorry about that. All right, another national resource is ChildMind. They have a whole resource guide on trauma and grief. Because when we're thinking about trauma, there's fallout from that trauma. There's children experience grief and other emotions. So thinking about all the different ways that trauma impacts students and families and teachers in the whole school. So I encourage you to check out all of their resources. They have tons of webinars and papers and external links at ChildMind. The National Resilience Institute offers trainings on trauma-informed community resilience building. So when you're thinking about trauma, that they directly address how you can build resiliency as a community. They have trainings on building a trauma and emergency response team and preventing secondary trauma and burnout. So when you're thinking about teachers supporting students that have experienced trauma, that's another great workshop and training that they offer. The National Resilience Institute also offers curriculums, consultations, and speaking engagements for your professional development as well. Another national resource is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. This is a great resource with tons of different webinars and other kind of engagements that you can attend virtually. They offer e-learning courses, and you can sort. This website was actually pretty cool for me to explore because you were allowed to sort by specific traumatic events or how you want to create your trauma-informed system. So there were topics about how trauma intersects with culture, how secondary trauma and stress impact schools and other systems. So I highly encourage you to check this one out too when you're thinking about your own professional development and that of your school and staff. And the last resource that I'll share is the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. I think I mentioned them a little bit earlier, but they have adapted a lot of their resources to be COVID specific, but they have tons of resources there on the website about trauma-informed school systems, how to address before, during, and after a pandemic, but also very specific family trauma and other traumatic events. They have webinars and resources for. So I encourage you to check those out. I think almost weekly they've been coming out with online Zoom sessions that you can attend. So feel free to check that link out. They have tons of resources there, trainings, events, resources, and projects. And with all of that, I want to encourage you, tomorrow we're not actually going to be live. We're going to have a pre-recorded session. There was just some scheduling conflicts as we're learning to be flexible in this remote learning, but we will be talking about professional development through the lens of social emotional learning tomorrow. So I encourage you to tune back in here on YouTube and hear from us again. So with that, I will stop sharing. I want to encourage everybody to have a great afternoon, and feel free to post your comments or questions here in the chat. We do check them, after we're done going live, and we hope to see you guys tomorrow.
So Molly, before we do close out, I'm finishing up posting a few of the end links into the comments, and I want to make sure I get those in there for folks who would like to just click to the resource. And I was wondering, while I do that, if you're the one who's really done this incredible wealth of research on trauma-informed resources, were there any that you came across while you were researching that you were thinking, wow, if I was in a district or school, I would really like to take a peek at that and explore it more?
I think that's a great question. I think the Center on the Developing Child offers a lot of great resources on brain development, and my background in psychology leads me to be really interested in that. Some people can't really wrap their heads around it, but I think when you get down to the science of it and really understanding, when a child is experiencing a traumatic event and their stress response system has been triggered, they can't access their upper brain. I think that's the most interesting to me. So I would check out those types of resources. I know the Center on the Developing Child has a lot of resources. Dr. Jack Shonkoff is the director there, and he does his public speaking engagements. And he also, he used to have in-person engagements down in Cambridge, but just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to brain development and thinking about how we can support students in regulating and reaccessing their upper brains.
Perfect. I got got the links in, but I also really agree with you too. I think like one of the most revelatory things I learned when doing some trauma-informed instruction professional development was how the brain operates when there's a traumatic event that's been experienced, and how it is a neurological issue. It's not just how do we develop empathy for people, but there's actually, neuroscience taking place, and we need to address that and treat it in an informed way.
Absolutely. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I had a lot of fun talking about this. I love researching these types of things. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.